speaker, Ken Johnston. Ken is a career teacher, science teacher, but in the summer months, he didn't just lay around and take the summers off. He was a park ranger, and at Lassen State Park, is that right? Not Lassen National Park, excuse me. While there, he prepared a first-person interpretation or living history presentation about Peter Lassen, an early Danish immigrant who kind of determined one of the pioneer routes into California, but who is perhaps not remembered very fondly for that legacy. And so that got Ken really curious about what was the real history behind Peter Lassen. Why is he not as remembered as he should be, unless you know your way around California parks? And so he'll give us the story of someone who we should be more familiar with. Okay.
Thank you, Tola. It's a real pleasure to be here in Elkhorn. I'll have to say we're from the West Coast, Oregon, but California has Solvang, and that's one of our favorite places. We love the windmills and double steamers for breakfast, and so it's kind of a pleasure to be here too. Anyway, when I got out of the Navy after the Vietnam War, I went to work as a ranger at Lassen National Park, which is in Northern California. And I worked as a ranger, giving campfire talks, taking hikes, working in the visitor center, and they hired me also to do a living history program on the geology of the park and the trails and things. Lassen was the last active volcano. It's a 10,000 foot, 454 foot volcano in Northern California in the Cascade Range. And like I said, it was the last active volcano until Mount St. Helens. It started erupting 100 years ago in can you hear me back there? It started erupting 100 years ago in 1914, it erupted until 1921, and was made a national park. My job there, though, in addition to being a ranger, was to do a living history program on the immigrant trails, because the Lassen Immigrant Trail and the Nobles Immigrant Trail went right through the park or right around the park. And I had a couple of oxen, a covered wagon, and horses, and this is part of the Nobles Trail. It goes right through the park, and my job was to set up the oxen and to talk to people about the development of trails in California, like the Oregon Trail. The California Trail developed a little later, and so I had to do a lot of research on that to do the presentation. Talked about life on the trail, how they live day to day, and the development of the trails from the beginning. The original trail started in Independence, went out through South Pass up into Oregon, and in 1841, people tried to branch off and go into California. And the first wagon train made it, but they had to abandon their wagons in Nevada. The first wagon train actually to make it into California was in 1845. And they got wagons all the way through, and then more travel came down into California. But you've probably heard of the Donner tragedy, the cannibalism and things that was on these trails. And Peter Lassen developed a trail that came up and avoided that, and a third of the Gold Rush came over his trail. So it was quite an interesting topic to do research on. When I was doing the research, though, probably the Bible of the trails, the development of the trails, was called the California Trail by George Stewart, who was a professor at Berkeley University. And he didn't do very good research on Peter Lassen. All the others, he did really good research, but he wrote, and this really caught my attention, a generation later it became legend, and old men of Lassen County were telling tales. But the stories have a ring of truth about them, at least that legendary truth, which sometimes comes closer to basic reality than mere history can. And I thought, legendary truth? You know, he should have done a little bit better work on the journals and things. He did his work, though, on a history book that was written by Asa Fairfield in Lassen County, and Asa talked to all the local people and did a real good history on the area, but he picked up the legends of Lassen. And Asa, in his book, wrote, yeah, it looks as though Lassen didn't know where he was going. They used to say when he got to Goose Lake, he saw Mount Shasta one day and Lassen's Butte the next. He didn't know the difference and traveled one day toward one of them and the next day toward the other. However, Fairfield adds this disclaimer: the writer will not vouch for the truthfulness of either story, but he has heard both of them told a good many times. And these stories are how the truth gets buried in legend. Peter Lassen, though, has more things named after him in Northern California than any other pioneer except for John C. Fremont and Kit Carson, and they're known all over the West. But they were also friends of his. And as I said, Lassen had Lassen National Park, Lassen Peak, that's a 10,454-foot volcano. He has a national forest, Lassen National Forest. There's Lassen County in California, Lassen County Courthouse. There's Lassen High School, Lassen Junior College in Susanville. There's the Lassen Historical Museum, Lassen Creek, lots of topographical names. You can even buy a car at Lassen Motors. And in Susanville, well, let's see, during World War II, there was an ammunition ship commissioned, the USS Lassen. And back in the 1990s, about 15, 20 years ago, another ship called the USS Lassen was a guided missile destroyer. So he has lots of things named after him. And in Susanville, there's a brewery called the Lassen Ale Works. So he has all these things named after him. But history books, and one of the classic books is Across the Plains by John Unruh, and he said a host of 49ers reported that they were much influenced in their decision to follow the Lassen Trail, but the cutoff proved to be one of the biggest humbugs in 1849. Or was it really? And he also said here the wily Dane orchestrated a meeting and had a deceptive endorsement. And in The Great West by David Lander, he called Lassen an incompetent Dane. And this just didn't balance. So that's why I did a lot of the research. But who was Peter Lassen? He was Danish. He was born in Denmark, in Farum, Denmark, in 1800, and grew up in the town of Farum, this kind of farming community. His folks were itinerant farmers, poor. He went to school there and did fairly well in grade school. When he was a young man, he apprenticed to his uncle, who was a blacksmith, and became a skilled blacksmith. The times were tough in Denmark at the time, and in 1829, he appealed to the king to immigrate to America. And this is an old map that shows kind of Lassen's trail. Or not his trail, but his arrival. He landed in Boston in 1829, lived on the eastern seaboard for maybe a year or two, and then he moved to Keatsville. And this shows Keatsville south of St. Louis, but Keatsville is actually about 100 miles north of St. Louis. He had a farm there, and then later he came on to the West Coast. But he had a farm in Keatsville. He also helped Keat, who Keatsville was named after, build Keat's Mill, and he worked as a blacksmith in the area in addition to farming. This was in 1829 and the 1830s. Interest was growing in the West. Times were tough in the East, and there were books written. Washington Irving wrote about the travels well, he wrote about Astoria and the travels of, losing the name, well, there was the Leatherstocking and several books on travels to the West and things, and a lot of interest was growing in the West. And in 1836, Marcus Whitman and his wife Eliza took the trail all the way into Oregon and got wagons into Oregon and proved women could actually make the trail across. So there's more interest. And by 1839, Peter Lassen joined a group of trappers and a couple of missionaries and a wagon train going out the Oregon Trail to Oregon. Fortunately, on that trip, there was a wealthy doctor from Switzerland, Wesley Zanus, Dr. Wesley Zanus, that kept a detailed journal. And he talked about the Indians he saw on the way, the trail life, how they handled the oxen and the animals, and the scenes along the way. And they traveled all the way out through South Pass up to Fort Hall. Then Wesley Zanus returned a southern route, but Lassen and the rest of the party went all the way on up to Fort Vancouver, right by Portland on the Columbia River.
And at that time, Fort Vancouver was held by the Hudson Bay Company, and they had trappers that traveled up and down what was called the Old Trappers Trail, all the way down past Sutter's Fort into California and back, and it was a well-known trail. And Lassen and the people wanted to take that trail down, but it was late in the fall of 1839, and they expected snow, the Indians were troublesome, he couldn't get a party to go. So he had to winter over in 1849 in Vancouver, Fort Vancouver, and then he caught a ship down into California. This was in 1840. He got into California, and he went to Sutter's Fort, which is in Sacramento. He had met Sutter. Sutter had come out a few years earlier from Missouri and had apparently been an acquaintance of Lassen. But Lassen went to work for Sutter some of the time, and you can still visit Sutter's Fort in Sacramento. It's a historic area and a very interesting place to visit. But while Lassen was there, some horses were stolen by immigrants going up into Oregon on the Old Trappers Trail, and Lassen and John Bidwell and some other people formed a posse and went after the horses. They went up the Sacramento River from Sutter's Fort up almost all the way to Redding. They got up into Tehama County. They recaptured captured the horses from the people, or got them back anyway, and were coming back, and they were so impressed with the mountains on each side of the Sacramento River and the beautiful valley and the trees and things, that Lassen applied for a land grant from the Mexican government. He had to become a citizen of Mexico, but he was awarded Bosquejo, Rancho Bosquejo, and he moved up there in 1843, befriended the local Indians and had them working for him. He built adobe houses, was doing blacksmithing for people who were going up and down the Old Trappers Trail. And he was also trapping, growing crops, and with some neighbors, they quarried millstones and shaped millstones and took them down to Sacramento and also to San Francisco. And he was very industrious. He was even building a grist mill. But in 1846, John C. Fremont came up. This is a picture of the house just before it was finally torn down. But anyway, John C. Fremont and Kit Carson came up to Lassen's ranch. They'd been in California. And Fremont wanted to go north up into Oregon. He wanted to get back up to Oregon to Klamath Lake because he'd been up there in 1843. He wanted to connect the trails and things. So he visited Lassen. They became close friends. And after Fremont left, about 3 days later, a Marine lieutenant came from Washington out by ship to California, arrived at Lassen's, and he had secret orders for Fremont because Fremont had an Army battalion. Well, anyway, he was dressed as a civilian so people wouldn't suspect him in Mexican-owned California. They talked Lassen and a couple of his neighbors into guiding them up to Klamath Lake, which is in Oregon. That's where we live, by the way. And they started at Lassen Rancho on the Sacramento River, followed the river up the Old Trappers Trail, crossed the mountains just above Lassen Peak, crossed the mountains, and the Old Trappers Trail actually went up by Mount Shasta in here, but another branch of the trail went up to Klamath Lake. And when they got to Klamath Lake, they met Fremont, and Lieutenant Gillespie gave him the orders, and for some reason that night Fremont didn't post a guard by the camp, and they were attacked by local Indians. They fought off the local Indians, killed some of them, but 3 of Fremont's Delaware Indian guides were killed in the attack. And so Fremont named the creek that they were camped on Denny Creek in honor of one of the Indians. And you can still see the monument there just west of Klamath Falls. The Lassen and Fremont were quite angry about losing their guides and being attacked. So for the next couple of days, they spent time. They left their camp and they went all the way around Klamath Lake, killing all the Indians, local Indians they could in retribution. Then they rushed back down the same trail they came down until they got to the Pitt River, and instead of following the old trail, they cut across the river at this bend and came down almost to Lassen Peak and across, and then down to Lassen Rancho.
Dad,
Yes?
you misspoke. You said Lassen was in that killing party. You meant Kit Carson was in that killing territory about Lassen?
Well, Lassen and Kit Carson and Fremont and all of them went around the lake killing as many people. The whole party went after the Indians on the way back. So, sorry if I misspoke on it. Anyway, when they got back to California, then the Bear Flag Revolt was going strong. John Sutter joined the revolt, and ultimately, California fell to the United States, the Americans that were there. And the U.S. Navy sailed into Monterey Bay. And the U.S. Navy was under the command of Commodore Sloat, and because California was now American territory, he raised the flag over the armory in Monterey. And Fremont came riding into Monterey, and when he showed the orders that he had to Commodore Sloat, the orders weren't really specific that you got to do this. And Commodore Sloat kind of panicked. He thought, maybe I've overstepped my bounds and things, and he resigned his position. Claimed he was getting old and sick, and he resigned. Well, second in command was Commodore Stockton, Robert Stockton. Stockton was a real man of action, and he got along really well with Fremont. And Stockton and Fremont continued capturing California. They went down to San Diego, to Los Angeles, and California was officially part of the United States, or United States territory. So they sent Kit Carson as a courier back to Washington with a message. Well, when Kit Carson got into Arizona, just north of the Mexican border, he met up with General Stephen Watts Kearny, who was in charge of American forces coming back from the Mexican War, because Mexico had fallen. And Kearny found out from Kit Carson that California had been taken. Well, Kearny still had orders to go to California. So he had Kit Carson guide him back, sent another courier to Washington. When they got to California, there was a rebel Mexican force that attacked Kearny on a hill, and Kearny was wounded and almost killed, but Kit Carson snuck out at night and went and got Marines help from Commodore Stockton, was sent back in, and they saved Kearny, and Kearny moved on into California. And then when he met with Stockton, he showed Stockton orders. He had actual orders from President Polk to take California from the Mexicans. Well, Stockton says, well, we've already done that, and I did it, you know. And Kearny, a general, says, but I'm the man that's in command. Well, a general and a commodore are pretty much equal, so there was a big rivalry. And Stockton says, we even saved your life, you know, and we did all this. And so he appointed John C. Fremont as the military commander or governor of California. Well, Kearny was against that and told Fremont that he couldn't do that, and Fremont naively followed the orders of the man he'd been working with. Well, he was an army officer and was in insubordination, so there's a big thing to do about that. And ultimately, Kearny took Fremont back to Washington, D.C. for a court-martial. Now, this is all happening in 1846. A lot of other things were happening in 1846. I said that in 1845, the first wagon train actually got wagons into California over Truckee Pass, which later became known as Donner Pass. 1846, another group of Oregonians developed what was called the Applegate Trail into Oregon, because the Applegates had gone the original Oregon Trail and lost two sons floating down the Columbia River. So they wanted to find a safer way. So they found a southern route into California, into Oregon. And this was all happening in 1846. Well, as soon as the snow melted in the spring of 1847, some of the Donners had been rescued, but anyway, Kearny, with Fremont in tow, headed east over the mountains and down, and they were the first people to come on to the Donner campsite where the Donners had camped for the winter. And they saw, well, the snow was starting to melt out, so Fremont, or Kearny had some of these men bury the grizzly remains that had melted out, and then they headed on east to court-martial Fremont. Well, about 2 weeks later, more snow had melted out, and Commodore Stockton headed east, and he was going to go back to Washington to defend Fremont. But with the Stockton party, Peter Lassen joined in. Childs, McGee, and Myers were also real noted Western guides, and they were all headed east in 1847. This is 2 weeks after the Kearney party. And they also saw Donner remains and buried them. But because of that, and because of having traveled over Donner Pass, going east, they saw how steep and rugged it was, and knew that people had to even take their wagons apart to get them up over the cliffs and things. So as they traveled east, they told anybody that was going west not to go to California over Donner Pass, but to take that new route, the Applegate Trail, up in toward Oregon, and then come into California on the Old Trappers Trail. And Lassen was privy to that information. Well, he got back to Missouri in 1847 and organized a party of some of his friends. He also, one of his missions was to get a Masonic charter to take to California, because he was a Mason. And in 1848, Lassen led a wagon train of about 10 to 12 wagons west toward California. As they were headed down, well, they came on the California Trail down the Humboldt River, and when they were on the Humboldt River, a Mormon train was going east. This is 1848. And this Mormon train going east had news that gold had been discovered in California. They even had gold nuggets to prove it. And there was, the news hadn't got back to the East Coast yet. It had got to Oregon though. And a group of Oregonians were coming down the Old Trappers Trail with wagons and supplies and things to get to California. So this is all happening as Lassen is heading west with his wagons. Now Lassen comes down, the news to Lassen and his wagon train of the gold happened about here. But he got down here, he turned on the old Applegate Trail, which they had recommended to others, and followed it up to Goose Lake. And then he turned south, coming down the Pitt River to his ranch, and avoided all of this area. It was a little further, but they got in. However, as they were coming down, he was running out of supplies. He only had a party of about 10 wagons, so few workers to really clear a new trail. And he was having some hardships and things, running out of supplies. But this other wagon train was coming south, and when they get down here, they see wagon tracks, and they're surprised. They follow the wagon tracks, they realize Lassen is ahead of them, and they ultimately catch up with Lassen. This was the Peter Burnett party. Anyway, about 15 years ago, I decided I'd been over the trail several times with four-wheel drive and things, but I decided to ride a mountain bike over the trail. So I went out to the Humboldt River, close to Winnemucca, California, and started, now I-80 goes right down by the Humboldt River also, and rode my mountain bike up through Black Rock Desert, and on the rest of the way, this is a mountain bike, and this is just off of I-80, where there's a big sign that talks about the Lassen Applegate Trail, and you drive about a mile down this dirt road, and you come to the Humboldt River that flows down into what was known as Lassen Meadows, where the Lassen Trail cut off to the north. This is at the river, where I loaded my bike and started riding. And after about 12 miles, we come to Antelope Springs. They've been bulldozed out now, so there's more water, and it's a little bit better spring probably than when the immigrants came through there. Then you go up over the hill, over the middle, up over that pass, and drop down, and it comes to Rabbit Hole Springs. This is what Rabbit Hole Springs looks like now. But when the Applegates discovered it in 1846, they followed rabbit trails and found little pools of water. They called it Rabbit Hole Springs. And they were able to dip water out. Well, this enabled them to get across to the Black Rock Desert. And so it's called Rabbit Hole Springs. Now it's a pretty good watering trough. But going over, continuing on, you drop down into the desert, Black Rock Desert. And this is the trail going down. There's the playa. And Black Rock, in the distance, was the place that they guided to. Wagons going across the playa toward Black Rock. There is a river there in the wintertime that you can really get stuck in, but by the time the immigrants got there, it's all dry and hot desert. There's an old shepherd's wagon right at the Black Rock that's pretty much weathering away, but at the Black Rock, there's a hot spring. And as the water runs out and down, it waters the area so there's grass for oxen, and the water cools so the oxen can drink. And it was a major camping ground after they made it across the desert there. And then hot springs again. And about 5 miles north of that is Double Hot Springs. And the water is so hot there that the immigrants in their journals mentioned that they could just put their coffee pot in there and it would boil their coffee, or they could cook their eggs and breakfast or whatever just in the hot springs. They had to let the water run on down to cool the use. Okay, so I've ridden my mountain bike following the Lassen Trail, past Rabbit Hole, up past Black Rock Desert, and then it goes through a real pretty, beautiful high rock canyon, past High Rock Lake, and then comes down into what's called Surprise Valley. But the next section, this High Rock Canyon. Picture wagons going through the canyon. Narrow, not a whole lot more room than just for wagons to go through, but Fremont had found this canyon in 1843, came down through, and it's just a cut right through the mountains for wagons or trails. The Indians had used it for centuries. And this is the trail again through High Rock Canyon. And the rocks go up maybe 400 to 500 feet. There's an old Indian cave in there that the journals all mention. That's Joe standing in the cave. And they recommend that if you go through that, and you can drive through with four-wheel drive, they recommend that you go with somebody else in case you have car problems, and that you take 2 extra tires just in case. I've never had a flat tire, but one of the leaders of our group did have a flat tire, showing that he needed a spare. Of course, he had a lot of people to help him change the tire, and we were on the road again pretty quickly. But one thing we learned, we have a new pickup, and you go through all that brush and things, it can really scratch up the side of your car. So we bought clear contact paper and a couple of rolls of contact paper. We'll cover the car, and it really looks strange, but all of these scratches on the side are called Nevada pinstriping, and if you don't have that tape on the car, the contact paper, that scratching is in your paint instead of on the contact paper. Well, you get back, peel the contact paper off, you don't even have to wash it because the dust is on the outside, and you don't have the scratches. And a lot of people say, boy, we wish we'd have thought of that. Get through High Rock Canyon, it opens out into a meadow area, camping area, and then it goes through another called Upper High Rock Canyon that is really rugged. The road doesn't even go through it now. On wagons, they talk about breaking axles and all the problems they had. I rode my mountain bike through it, but you get up to the top of it, and it comes out on a highland that drops down into Surprise Valley in California. The town of Cedarville is down there. There are hot springs and things in the valley. And when people got here, they saw those mountains, and they said, the Sierra Nevadas, we get over those and we're in California. Well, they're in California, but this is the Warner Mountains, and they've still got to go over that, and it's still got miles to go. So it's kind of a disappointment to them, because it wasn't actually the Sierra Nevadas. So anyway, we've come down into Surprise Valley. There's a lake, and then the trail goes north just slightly and over what was called Lassen's Pass. It's now called Fandango Pass, and then drop down to Alturas, California. Then the trail follows the Pitt River, and that's what Lassen would have been following as a river because they had water. But notice after you get to Alturas, you're heading this way, and what's right ahead? Mount Shasta. Then the trail turns south, and straight ahead is Mount Lassen. And the old legends say one day Lassen went towards Mount Shasta, and the next day he went toward Lassen, and he didn't know the difference. Well, my daughters at 10 years old could sure point out Shasta and Lassen, and so that's just one of those legendary truths. I'm sure Peter Lassen knew the difference. All of the journalists, when they were going in 1849, recognized the difference. And that's Mount Shasta off to the northwest. The river, this is the Pitt River, and it cuts south down through what's called Hanging Rock Canyon. And Hanging Rock Canyon is very similar to High Rock Canyon, perhaps not quite as high, but very pretty. And they had to cross the river several times. It's fairly shallow for crossing. And then when they got through that, they came into Big Valley. The town of Beaver is down in here, and Mount Lassen is off to the south. And the Pitt River goes down through a real steep canyon that they couldn't follow through. And from that area, if you look off that direction, you see Mount Shasta. If you look off to the south, you can, in places, see Mount Lassen. And like I say, probably wouldn't mistake either one because of where they are located. And that's that real steep canyon that the river goes through. Now the Pitt River is the main tributary to the Sacramento. And Fremont, in his map, called it the Sacramento River. So there was some legendary truth to the main tributary should be the Sacramento River. But it was named by trappers earlier as the Pitt River because Indians had dug pits to trap animals. And so the Pitt River is really the beginning of the Sacramento, but it's the Pitt River, and people thought they were on the Sacramento when they were on the Pitt, and it was more legendary truths. But anyway, it goes through this canyon you couldn't follow it into California. Okay, and that was Big Valley, where we came out of Hanging Rock Canyon, and where Fremont and Lassen in 46 came straight down rather than going over on the Trappers Trail. Lassen came across and came down toward Mount Lassen. About 10 miles south of there, he cut over trying to reach that Trappers Trail. And he couldn't get there because of difficulties, but anyway, he was coming down here, and I mentioned that big party from Oregon that was coming down with lots of men and help. They got down into this area, and they were planning on coming into California for gold. They saw tracks, wagon tracks, and they were surprised that the wagons had been here. They followed them down, and they actually caught up with Lassen down here. But when they got to here, they also saw where Lassen turned off, and this is what Peter Burnett wrote. Well, first, coming up out of the river area, it goes up into a highland, and then it becomes more wooded, and even more wooded. Now, imagine if you have a team of oxen that are about 10 feet, wagon tongue, and then 10 feet of wagon, you have a rig about like a car with a camper trailer. Now, imagine driving that camper trailer through those trees without a road. Kind of hard to maneuver. If you have two teams of oxen, 10 and 10 and wagon, you have a rig almost like a short semi-truck. Again, very difficult. So what they did was they cut their wagons in half and made ox carts out of them. Of course, most of their supplies had been used up by now, and they're running out of supplies and things. So they cut down their wagons and maneuvered on through. And like I say, Lassen's party was pretty destitute by this time. And when Peter Burnett comes down and finds the tracks, the wagon tracks, they start following it, and they come to a valley. And he says this valley is about 2 miles wide where the road struck it and ran west, the very direction we wished to go. It seemed a defile passing at right angles through the Sierra Nevada mountains, as if designed for a level road into the Sacramento Valley, where they were ecstatic. We were much pleased at the prospect and followed this splendid road rapidly about 8 miles, when to our great mortification, we came to the termination of this lovely valley in front of a tall, steep mountain which could not be ascended except by some creature that either had wings or claws. And for years, we hunted for this steep mountain that only could be ascended, and there's no mountain there. About 2 years ago, Burnett then assumed Lassen was lost, and then he found where Lassen had turned around and gone back, and he followed him on down. Well, we had hunted for this, and a couple of years ago, one of the historians was out there, and he found this beautiful valley. This is Lassen Peak, by the way, and the valley kind of goes off to the west, easy traveling, and he followed it out there about 8 miles like Burnett. Never did find a steep mountain, except he came to Hat Creek Fall. The old Trappers Trail went this way. He got there. Burnett, Lassen couldn't get down because it's too steep. Only an animal with wings or claws could ascend that mountain. We had it backwards when we were reading the journal. But anyway, that's where I was. And it took until 1852 before they found a route that would get down that, so they didn't have to go all the way around Lassen Peak. But Lassen then continued on down just to the left or to the east of Mount Lassen. So we come down from Big Valley, and this is that area where Lassen supposedly got lost, but he couldn't get through. And then came on down around Mount Lassen and into big meadows here, and then on down into his rancho. And this is about where Peter Burnett caught up with him. Some of Lassen's party had revolted in a lot of wagon trains. They were split up and others would join. If you travel with a family for a month in a car, you have some problems. You travel with 10 wagons for 3 months, you're going to have some problems. And all the wagon trains did. And some of the people revolted against Lassen, and they packed their oxen and took off. Well, Lassen insisted you stay on this ridge between Mill Creek and Deer Creek. the people that revolted packed their oxen and went down to the water. And it took him about 3 days later to get in and Lassen. But when Peter Burnett caught up with him, with his manpower, he was able to clear the road as fast as they could travel along. They just traveled along and ended up at Lassen Ranch. And we're quite happy to get there, actually. But this is following down the ridge between Mill Creek and Deer Creek. You can see it's pretty steep country, but if you stay up on top of the ridge, you're okay. If you get down in, this is Mill Creek. You can imagine what those people that revolted and went down through ran into. Very difficult. And this is a road going down the ridge. You can see it going on down. I rode my bike going down it. Going down. Pretty rugged, but wagons went down it fairly well until they got down into the Sacramento Valley where Lassen's Rancho was. Now, that was in 1848. Next year is 1849. News now has gotten back to the East Coast, and the gold rush is on. Thousands of people, like 35 to 40,000 people, are going to head west. But the people that are heading west aren't the mountain men and the outdoor people that had been in the past. This year, there are doctors and lawyers and school teachers and family men and everybody heading west, selling their farms. And it's called the Year of the Novice, or the Year of the Greenhorn, because they don't know how to handle what they expect, but they're following all these wagons west. By the time, well, the first 2/3 of the wagon trains actually went over Donner Pass and the Mormon Trail, but with these thousands of animals and things eating grass and things, all the grass is gone, and by the time they get up in here, even the grass is pretty bad, pretty much eaten up, and rumor has it that there's no grass left. So a couple of the trail guides that were with Lassen and Stockton coming east knew the area, they could recommend going this way, and so they turned off. Well, they were noted guides, and the rest of the immigrants, the last 9,000 of the gold rush, followed them on the Lassen Trail up the Applegate and then down into California. But it's a little further. And like I said, a lot of the greenhorns didn't know what they were doing. They were just following these noted guides. Well, they take the Lassen Trail, a new trail is called a cutoff. The cutoff's shorter, right? But this is 200 miles longer. Peter Lassen must have deceived them. So he's a bungling Dane, even though he's off somewhere else. So there's some more legendary truths. They got to Rabbit Hole Springs. I showed you the picture of Rabbit Hole Springs. This is one of the immigrants' journals. And by the time they got to the rabbit holes, they dug out wells for the animals to get water, but some of the animals would be so thirsty they died in, and then they couldn't get them out, and it was really a hardship. They had trouble getting through. A lot of them abandoned some of their equipment and things going across the desert. Wagons were abandoned, they packed oxen and things, and some of them even got caught in snow. This is Bruff, kept a real detailed journal, and he actually stayed at this camp about 30 miles east of Lassen's ranch because he had a lot of mining equipment and things, and he was the head of the company, so he stayed there to guard the things, sent the others down to get help, and come back to help him. Well, they got down there and they went hunting for gold. So he spent the winter there, but he helped other immigrants that were coming through, and he drew pictures of people that are straggling in. They lost their animals, they abandoned things, and they're just carrying what they can to get in. But ultimately they get down to Lassen's Rancho, and this is the creek where it comes into Lassen's Ranch today. The buildings are gone, but there is a monument there. Now, was Lassen really a bungling, deceptive, wily Dane? Did he orchestrate one of the biggest humbugs? And where did these rumors arise? Well, we talked about Peter Burnett because he followed Lassen's trail out to where that steep area was that couldn't get through. And he assumed Lassen was lost, so he said Lassen must have been lost. Well, that was written. Historians read the journals, they read that, Lassen got lost, it's written. And John Bidwell, he was with Lassen in 1843 when they went north up to Sacramento to get the horses that had been stolen. And when they're coming back, Peter Lassen is in the lead, and they come back down the Sacramento Valley. You get down just north of Sacramento, there's this little mountain range that goes east and west across the Sacramento Valley. It's called Sutter's Buttes. And Lassen's in the lead, and he's heading toward that. And Sutter had a farm, the hog farm, just on the other side of the buttes. Lassen's headed for that. John Bidwell and some others are following him with the new horses they captured back. And Lassen heads right for those buttes. And the Indian with John Bidwell said, no, we got to turn this way and go around the buttes. And Lassen says, yeah, it's just right over there. We're going to go along that way. Well, Lassen insisted. Bidwell followed the Indian. They went around. They got to a hot farm that night. Well, Lassen got down in here, and there's wetlands. It's a wildlife refuge and things. Got stuck in there. The next day, he got over the mountains and down and came in. And Bidwell wrote in his journal that if you haven't met a Dane that has spent the night in the marshes with mosquitoes, you have something to live for. And besides, Peter Lassen thinks he's quite a mountain man, but he always gets lost. Well, you know, you don't get lost there, but it's kind of just a tongue-in-cheek thing. But the journalists read that. Well, he always got lost, and he didn't know the difference between Mount Shasta and Mount Lassen and things. So, kind of interesting stories. But when the immigrants were coming in at the end of 1849, the Californians and the Army in San Francisco were concerned because all these thousands of people were coming in. They knew about the Donner tragedy, and they allocated $100,000, bought oxen and supplies, and sent troops under Major Rucker east to help bring these people back into the valley. They go to the Mormon Trail. There are no people on it. They go to the Donner Pass Trail, the Rucker Trail. No people on it. They've all gone the last third. So they sent all the help to Lassen's Trail, bring the people in, and Major Rucker in his report writes, although the distance is much greater than by the old routes, and some of the immigrants were much longer in getting in, I cannot but think it a fortunate circumstance they did, for the loss of property would have been greater on the old trail, as the grass would have been eaten off long before they could arrive. And they would have probably died if they had been on Donner Pass, like the Donner Party. But this saved their lives, even though it was longer. So ironically, the Lassen Trail probably saved the lives of thousands of immigrants that year. But Lassen, this is 1849, 1850. Well, the immigrants coming in, they kill cattle that Lassen has at his ranch. They take supplies that he doesn't have enough of. And ultimately, it kind of ruins Lassen, like it did Sutter. Sutter was run by the Gold Rush, too. But there's word of gold in the mountains, and Lassen is interested in. And there's this story of a gold lake up in the mountains. People go off looking for this gold lake. And Peter Lassen, with a party, and Bruff, that kept the journals and the pictures, went with him off looking for this gold lake. And Joe and I found it about 4 years ago. And you can actually see the gold that floats in off of the lake on the sides. But we haven't been able to find it since. As nobody else was able to ever find that gold lake. But anyway, Lassen went looking for it. This is a picture that Bruff drew. And this is Bruff again, sitting by a tree. They're resting off in the mountains just east of Lassen Peak. And Lassen's lying down resting in the afternoon. Well, later, and notice Bruff wrote his name in the tree. J.G. Bruff, or J.G.B., 1850. And he, in his journal, when Bruff didn't feel very well, so he stayed in camp and kind of guarded camp and things while Lassen went. And he actually wrote that Lassen went out around the north edge of Mount Lassen looking for gold. And the fellow that I told you found where the trail went down the steep, or couldn't go down instead of up, his wife found this aspen tree just north of Lassen Peak, and it's really hidden back in the tree. But it says Lassen 1850. It's obviously an old scar, but aspen trees only live maybe 100 years at the most, huh? So how did this get there? Who put it there? It's one of the mysteries again. But I thought it was quite interesting that they found this tree, and it's like Bruff has his name on it, but most people don't believe that Lassen actually did it. But it's another one of the mysteries about Lassen. After 1853, Lassen moved down to south of Lassen Peak to a big valley called Indian Valley, a very lush valley, and started farming, built a trading post there with a partner, and supplied goods for the immigrants, because the Feather River that the gold was found on is just south of here, and he was supplying supplies and things. And then he moved on down east into, well, there's a marker there where he had his trading post in Indian Valley. Then he moved down to the town of Susanville. It was called Roop's Fort then, just to the east of the Sierras, and it was becoming a fairly large town by then, pretty popular. And Lassen set up a farm there, actually found some gold in one of the streams, and there's a minor gold rush there, not enough to really be a bit. Anyway, Lassen got kind of involved in the politics there, and the people of Susanville, they're east of the mountains. They say, we're not in California, we're not paying California taxes. We're east of the mountains, but we're too far west to pay taxes for Nevada. So we're going to set up our own territory and call it the Nautaqua Territory. And they actually voted Peter Lassen as the president of the Nautaqua Territory. But it was a big hubbub because it didn't work out anyway. But anyway, he was fairly popular. Well, in 1859, silver is discovered in Nevada. At least some immigrants that were coming over the Lassen Trail, when they get to California, they take out these rocks they picked up, then they thought they picked them up out in the Black Rock Desert, and they're real rich silver. Well, they try to remember where they found it, and people rush out there to see if they can find this silver lode that these people found. And they looked along the Black Rock Desert, and the Lassen Trail went right up through here. Well, Peter Lassen goes out there with a couple of other friends to try and find this silver lode. And actually, there was a rush there, and it became hardened city, and they actually built a city. Now all that's left is maybe a few chimneys and things from the city. But when Lassen got there, he was one of the first ones with his partners, and they were looking for another party from Susanville that had gone ahead of them, and they got up into the canyons just close to the Lassen Trail, and they couldn't find the other party. The other party was headed by Captain Weatherlow, but they got to this canyon, and it was getting late, so they camped by this rock, built a fire, spent the night, and the next morning, a shot rings out. Lassen and his partner Wyatt jump up, and they're looking up the canyon to see where the shot comes from. Lassen's looking up the canyon, Wyatt reaches down and shakes Clapper, and sees Clapper has a hole through his head, been shot in the head. He looks up, and Lassen's looking up the canyon, and another shot rings out. Lassen drops his rifle, grabs his chest, says, "I'm a dead man," and falls. Well, Wyatt then turns around, sees his horses tearing off down the canyon because the gunshots spooked the horses. Miraculously, one of the horses turned around, came back. He jumped on a horse, rode 140 miles back to Susanville, and told the people that Lassen and Clapper had been killed. And they sent a party out to bury Lassen's remains and things. Later, the remains were taken back to Susanville and buried. But Captain Weatherlow, that had camped a few miles, claimed he didn't know anything about it. They never heard the shots or anything when he heard about the Lassen death. But there's a marker there by that big rock that talks about Lassen's murder, and it was supposedly Indians that did it. But the only thing they found missing from Lassen's camp was his rifle. He had a nice old rifle, an old brown Bess, that had a nice maple stock, or no, a walnut stock. And anyway, interestingly enough, that rifle turned up about 2 years later. And there was a couple of wagons south of where Lassen had been murdered, and these wagons, they were freight wagons, had been attacked by a group of Indians. And the two men had been killed. Everything was taken from the wagons, typically of Indians, which wasn't like what had happened at Lassen's camp. Well, Captain Weatherlow, that I mentioned before, that had been camped up above Lassen, he is now in charge of Indian affairs. He takes a posse out, they track down the Indians, kill all of them except one. One gets away, standing on a rock, taunting because he thinks he's out of range. One of the men has a Sharps rifle, will shoot, and he kills the Indian. Weatherlow goes out and discovers, lo and behold, Lassen's rifle in the hands of this Indian. Mystery solved. The Indian must have killed Lassen, but why didn't he take all of Lassen's things like he did? Or did the two men that were driving the wagon kill Lassen and then lose the rifle to the Indians when everything was taken? Or did Weatherlow plant the rifle? All these things come up, and there's all kinds of mysteries and things that are pretty interesting to try and figure out. Lassen, like I said, his body had been taken back to the Susanville area and buried, and the Masons put a nice marker on it. And if you read it closely, it says, "In memory of Peter Lassen, the pioneer who was killed by the Indians, April 26, 1859, aged 66 years." Now remember, he was born in 1800. So even the legendary truths are etched in stone. But probably the best marker for Lassen is Mount Lassen, a 10,454 foot volcano, and Lassen National Park. And I wrote a book, Legendary Truths, about Peter Lassen, and I have it per se up here. And it tells in much more detail what I just told you about. I'm going to thank you folks for coming, and if you have questions, be sure and ask me, because I probably missed a whole lot of things in the time we had.
Are there any questions that, we've got a few minutes before 1 o'clock, anyone want to share any questions with all of us? Or I'm sure Ken will be happy to speak to you more one-on-one.
Yes?
So in your opinion, was he killed by the Indians or was he killed by somebody else?
I don't believe he was killed by Indians because